Imagine a man who smiled at children while planning their demise. Someone whose white coat not only hid a dark side, but a mind that was there to experiment on humans, thinking of them as mere rats. In the hell of Auschwitz, one figure stood out. He is known today as the Angel of Death. So, what twisted a promising student into history's most infamous monster? Step in the shadows of his lab, where science was just another name for slaughter. If you want to see the dark side of history, subscribe to our channel and let's get right into the video. The beginning. Imagine a quiet town in southern Germany in 1911, where a baby boy entered a cozy middle-class home surrounded by fresh-baked bread and the chatter of his siblings. That man is Josef Mengele. No one knew that Josef would grow up to terrorize thousands of people since his early years were picture-perfect. No dark secrets, no traumas, and no abusive shadows. Just a family scraping by comfortably with a father running a local business and a mother taking care of the children. Young Josef was a golden child, as he was a model student, a great sportsman, and a good person. But at 15, fate threw a total curveball at him as a nasty bone infection chained him to his bed for months. There, the boy saw feverish nights with endless aches. While it could have broken him and made him just a fraction of what he could be, instead, the infection lit a fire in him. Missing school? No chance. He devoured books and raced to catch up with others while becoming top of his class every single year. By 1930, Josef had doors open at Munich University for anthropology studies, where he aced everything and was sort of living the dream. But then the poison came in. The 1930s air was thick with bad ideas, with something like eugenics, which was basically planned breeding to create the best possible forms of humans. This gave Josef the idea that some humans were better, while others were nothing more than weeds to yank from the garden of humanity. Scientists everywhere peddled it as gospel. Aryans were on top, while everyone else was a drag on human progress. But according to Josef, the idea was to remove the weak and purify their race. Does it sound like someone we already know? Of course, an Austrian painted. From there, he graduated with a shiny PhD in 1935, where he earned his medical degree 2 years later in Frankfurt. There, everything changed because under a mentor, Josef, obsessed with racial hygiene, the Nuremberg laws, and the idea that Jews must be taken away from their jobs, schools, and citizenship. He started helping to enforce these ideas and then decided who belonged in Germany and who didn't. At this point, Nazi Germany was also rising to the top, and in 1937, Josef joined the Nazi Party, while a year later, the elite SS welcomed him with that black unformed brotherhood of Hitler's inner circle. Then, the war hit like a storm in 1939, and he was called up in 1949 in Poland, where Josef started judging ethnic fitness for Nazi settlement. The next front lines were against the Soviets, where bullets whizzed and everyone was getting destroyed. But Mengele thrived, patching wounds under fire. In 1942, Josef Mengele wounded himself, but he was a hero welcomed back to his desk work. The war was already getting darker, but his old boss pulled strings at a top institute, with Mengele's wish coming true. He always wanted to be somewhere where he would have subjects waiting with no rules attached, so he would do anything he wanted to them. The destination? Auschwitz. By 1943, the man who'd charmed classrooms was already bound for Hell's Gate. There, the most chilling moment of arrival was the selection. That's where Mengele himself stood at the ramp, scanning faces, assessing bodies, and raising his hand. One direction was towards the forced labor, while the other was towards the gas chamber. Few prisoners understood what was going to happen to them, while others escaped the fate that was decided in those very moments. For Josef, some selections were special. People like twins, dwarves, or physical anomalies were earmarked for experimentation. Parents sometimes even handed over their twins in the hope of survival, while prison guards also presented them as interesting material. This was the pinnacle of pseudoscience, under which human beings, mostly children, became living laboratories. Mengele used multiple barracks to put his subjects based on their age and research interests. To make things worse, one barrack held twin girls and even young boys, while the other held older or abnormal individuals. The third one? Well, that kept infants with their mothers. But what was life in those barracks? You'll be shocked to find out. It was quite different from the typical Auschwitz labor blocks. The twins were almost never forced into hard labor, and their sole purpose was to wait. You might ask, wait for what exactly? Mengele did his crazy experiments, which we will cover very soon. The bodies of these twins became a catalog of measurements, photographs, blood samples, X-rays, anatomical drawings, and every scar, freck, and deformity was recorded in huge detail. Oftentimes, the twin would die from the experiment itself, and the other was almost always killed too, so they could compare both. Organs, skulls, bones, eyes, everything was shipped to the SS labs in Germany. While we have Josef Mengele's life and his aspirations in check, now it's time to talk about all the twisted experiments that happened in the camp. What kinds of horrific madness did Mengele conduct? The methods were quite diverse and brutal, but before we dive deep, please subscribe to our channel if you love historical debunking videos. Twin experiments. The most infamous experiment in this case was surely the twins experiment. Mengele would inject one twin with a disease like typhus or tuberculosis, withhold treatment, and observe progression while the other twin was left untreated as a control. He also performed forced blood transfusions between incompatible blood types, and this resulted in nothing but a lot of mess. In some cases, he even amputated limbs of one twin to study regeneration, sometimes even implanting amputated limbs on the other one. To everyone, this is just a straight-up mess-up. However, to Mengele, this was much needed to understand the human body and its progression. Finally, when one of the twins would die, the survivor was often killed, so that their organs could be studied side by side. Eye color studies. Mengele was a man obsessed with the human body, but one of his lesser-known but twisted experiments would be on eye color. This was specifically the case of heterochromia, a condition where the eyes are always different colors. In his collaboration with genetic researchers like the equally crazy Karin Magnusson, they both attempted to alter eye color by injecting substances into living people's eyes, often adrenaline or other chemicals. To make it worse, he even removed eyeballs from prisons for historical study. The aim here, even though it was twisted, was to prove pseudoscientific claims of racial differences in pigmentation. But was it brutal? Of course, but not as brutal as what is coming next. You see, Mengele's approach was quite organized. He disguised murderous intent as methods to just collect data and employed prisoner doctors, forced by threat, to assist with dissections, autopsies, specimen preparation, and even pathology work. One such an example was Jewish-Hungarian pathologist Miklos Naisli, who was forced to procure organs for study. The pathology lab was also located near the crematorium too, enabling quick transfer of specimens from victims to research. Mengele's assistants carried out the post-mortem examinations to help understand anatomical features like bones, skulls, tissues, all labeled and organized, often shipped to the SS institutions in Berlin or Graz. By the end of the war, many of his records and samples were destroyed or lost, but the ones that were available were enough to confirm the scale of his crimes. Noma experiments. When an outbreak of Noma, the gangrenous facial disease, struck the Roma children, Mengele was the first one to exploit it. In these tough times, he used quarantined hospital wings in the camp to monitor the disease progression, withholding full treatment after the initial phase of Noma. He then preserved and shipped heads, organs, and tissues to the German labs for further analysis, sterilization, hormones, and radiology. After this, Mengele and the other Nazi doctors also experimented with sterilization, inserting caustic materials into reproductive organs, irradiating gonads, and even chemically sterilizing both men and women. But the worst was manipulating hormones, implanting and injecting unknown substances into the bodies to test fertility and growth rates. In some Nazi groups, Other doctors even tested hypothermia, high-altitude simulations, and gas exposures. These experiments weren't always Mengele's, but he was well aware of what was happening in his camp. Physical abnormalities and other traits. Mengele also studied dwarfism, as that was probably the topic of his interest the most. He liked seeing limb deformities and other abnormal physiologies. The notorious Auschwitz family was a group of dwarves that survived in Auschwitz because Mengele took them under his care. This wasn't out of compassion, but as rare specimens for his research. They underwent repeated cruel tests, frequent blood draws, extraction of teeth, bone measures, and even a lot of gynecological scrutiny. Overall, Mengele was a psychopath obsessed with human bodies and couldn't wait to exploit them for his personal gain and satisfaction. While many lost their lives to his madness, were there any survivors? Of course. Let's hear about the people who saw hell and still came back. Stories of the survivors. The Romanian twin sisters endured Mengele's crazy experiments. But decades later, Eva, the first twin, became a Holocaust educator. In the documentary, she spoke about her journey with the forgiveness of Josef Mengele, but never really forgot the trauma. Her sister was Eva Mozes, who also survived the brutal experiments of Mengele. Then there was the Hungarian Jew, and the survivor of the twin experiment, György Kun, who died very recently in 2025. He recalled how he and his brother were declared twins simply because they wore matching clothes, and this was their decision that spared their lives, while their mother was sent to the gas chamber for more torture. In the Roma camp, children afflicted with Noma were placed in isolation for observation, and then many were later killed while their specimens were shipped out. Many people survived this experiment. You might have heard about the prisoner named Helmut Semmens, who was an inmate messenger to Mengele. Clemens once accidentally witnessed Mengele injecting fluid into children's eyes. And just days later, the same children appeared in the corpse hall. As the Red Army neared in early 1945, Mengele knew his time in Auschwitz had expired. On January 18, 1945, he fled via a chain of Nazi networks, ultimately arriving in South America. Under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard, he lived in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and many other countries to avoid the cases. He even operated a company in Europe briefly before disappearing into the American jungles. And then, in 1979, he finally died by drowning while swimming. To this date, his death remained unknown, but in the end, Mengele never stood trial. His son was called Rolf, and he even recalled that his father remained unrepentant, denying any wrongdoing. But we can clearly see the agony he put thousands of people under. Do you think Mengele's inflicting pain was justified and much needed? Let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos like these.